The examination was supposed to end the guessing. Instead, it produced two things nobody expected: a mark on the back of an 18-year-old's head that no one can explain, and a body that arrived in Washington, D.C. missing part of its own throat. On the 19th of July, 2024, Dr. Roger A. Mitchell Jr. signed his preliminary report on the death of Nolan Xavier Wells. Mitchell is a board-certified forensic pathologist, the president of the National Medical Association, and the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia. This was the second autopsy performed on Nolan's body, paid for privately, arranged by a family that did not believe the first examination would be enough. His conclusion sits at the top of the report in 2 lines. Cause of death, undetermined, pending investigation. Manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. But it is what sits underneath that conclusion that has changed this case. Deep in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, over the occipital bone, Mitchell found an area of red discoloration. He could not say what caused it. He could not say when it happened. He could not say whether it was an injury at all, because a body that spent 2 days in the Gulf and then went through a full autopsy no longer answers questions cleanly. And when he went looking for the structures of the neck that might have told him more, they were not in the body. They had stayed behind in Mississippi. So this is not the answer the family was waiting for. It is something stranger and in some ways heavier. A report that rules nothing in, rules nothing out, and ends with 7 questions the pathologist says still have no answers. If you want this case reported carefully instead of loudly, go ahead and hit that like button right now and subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault. It decides whether the accurate version of Nolan's story travels as far as the rumors already have. Now, the room where this report was read out loud mattered as much as the document itself. On the morning of the 22nd of July at McCormack Place in Chicago, the 117th NOC National Convention was underway. In a room filled past capacity, Attorney Ben Crump stood at a podium with the pages of a forensic report in front of him, a set of anatomical diagrams propped on an easel beside him, and Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, seated a few feet away. Before he began, Crump asked them if they wanted to sit down. He warned the room this would be difficult to hear. Then he thanked the person who made the examination possible at all. Colin Kaepernick, whose organization covered the cost of flying Nolan's body to Washington and paying for a second autopsy his family could not have afforded on their own. To understand why that flight to Washington happened in the first place, you have to understand the mood in that room. The state of Mississippi had already examined Nolan's body. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed its autopsy on the 7th of July, one day after a park ranger found him in the water off Horn Island. That report has never been released. It is still, as of this recording, sitting incomplete while toxicology testing runs, a process the Jackson County coroner, Bruce Lynn Jr., has confirmed is not finished. So Nolan's parents were being asked to wait indefinitely for the answer to how their son died, from a system they had already stopped trusting within the first hour of his body being recovered. Rather than wait, they sent him 1,000 miles north and paid a second pathologist to look for himself. Dr. Mitchell was not there at that press conference. He did not speak, did not take questions, and has not given interviews about his findings. What the public received was his written preliminary report, read aloud page by page by the family's attorney. That distinction matters, and it will come up again, because almost everything the country now believes about this autopsy passed through a lawyer's voice before it reached anyone's ears. And a lawyer's job is advocacy, not pathology. Then Christine Wansley spoke, and she did not talk about evidence at all. "This has been a difficult journey," she said. "Losing a child truly breaks your heart." She had buried her son the day before. Now, what this report is and what it is not. Start with the basic architecture of the document, because it is not what most headlines suggested. This was a preliminary report, not a final one. Mitchell performed the examination on the 10th of July, 6 days after Nolan's body was recovered, and 3 days after the state had already conducted its own. He signed the report on the 19th. It was made public on the 22nd. In the identifying section, the decedent is listed as Nolan Xavier Wells, age 18, male. The date of death is listed as unknown. That single line, date of death unknown, is worth pausing on. It is not a clerical shrug. It means that from the body alone, no one can say with certainty when Nolan Wells died. Not the hour, not the day. Somewhere between the afternoon of the 4th of July and the morning of the 6th, and the science cannot narrow it further. It is also worth tracking the journey the body itself took, because every leg of it cost information. Nolan entered the water at some point on the 4th of July. A park ranger found him on the morning of the 6th. The Jackson County coroner, Bruce Lynn Jr., confirmed his identity through dental records. An ordinary step, but one that tells you something about the condition of the remains. On the 7th, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed the first autopsy, removing and dissecting the organs and retaining the neck structures. The body was then released to the family, flown to Washington, and on the 10th of July, examined a second time, 6 days from recovery to Mitchell's table. In July, after 2 days in the Gulf, decomposition does not pause for grief or for travel. Then comes the section that produced every headline in the country: preliminary findings. Mitchell did what a second pathologist is supposed to do. He went looking for what the first examination might have missed, and he went looking specifically for violence. The report lists the additional dissections he performed, procedures not carried out during the first autopsy: facial dissection, posterior head and neck dissection, dissection of the ribs and the pelvis, dissection of the subcutaneous and deep soft tissues, dissection of the back, the buttocks, the arms and the legs. In plain terms, he took the body apart layer by layer, looking underneath the skin for the marks that blunt force leaves behind, even when the surface looks clean. And across all of that work, this is what he found: no fractures, no deep tissue injuries, no lacerations. Say that clearly, because it cuts against how this report has been sold. The second autopsy did not find a broken bone, a stab wound, a bullet, a strangulation mark, or any deep tissue trauma anywhere on Nolan Wells's body. Crump acknowledged as much at that podium. The examination turned up no evidence of wrongdoing, with one exception, and the exception is the reason the room went silent. During the layered posterior neck dissection, the procedure where Mitchell opened the back of the head and neck in stages, he found an area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone. The occipital bone is the base of the skull at the back of the head, the part that would strike the ground if you fell backward. Fox 32 Chicago reported the dimensions given at the press conference described the area as measuring 12 by 8 inches. Crump, describing the moment he was shown the photographs, said you could not help but notice it. Why is this dark red here in the back of his head? Now, here is where careful listening matters more than anywhere else in this case, because the report itself immediately limits what that finding means. Mitchell wrote that the etiology of this finding, the cause of it, is unclear. He noted there were no lacerations of the overlying skin. He noted there were no fractures of the underlying skull. And then he wrote the sentence that almost nobody has quoted in full: these findings are inconclusive for perimortem injury due to both the extensive decomposition and the absence of associated injuries. Perimortem means at or around the time of death. So the pathologist is saying in his own words that he cannot conclude this mark was an injury sustained around the time Nolan died. Not that it wasn't, that he cannot conclude it was. But he did not dismiss it either, and that is equally important. He wrote that the finding is significant enough to be highlighted in this preliminary report for further investigation, and he added a detail with real weight. This finding could not have been observed during the first autopsy because the posterior head and neck dissection was not performed there. Read that carefully, because it is the strongest single sentence in the entire report for the family's position. Whatever that red area turns out to be, the state of Mississippi's examination never looked at it. Not because anyone hid it, because that particular dissection is not routine, and the state pathologist did not do it. Which means that if Nolan Wells suffered a blow to the back of the head, the state's autopsy would not necessarily have seen the evidence of it. That is the finding. So what does it actually mean? For that, you need someone with no stake in this case at all. CNN put the question to Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas. A working forensic pathologist with no connection to Nolan Wells, his family, or Mississippi. His answer laid out both possibilities without choosing between them. The red discoloration, he said, could represent decompositional changes of the musculature, or it could be from blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck, both sitting side by side from an outside expert with nothing to gain. Understand what decompositional change means here, because it is the explanation nobody wants to sit with, and it is entirely real. After death, blood settles and vessels break down. Tissue discolors on its own without anyone laying a hand on the body. In a body recovered from warm Gulf water after roughly 2 days, then examined once, then transported across the country and examined again 6 days after recovery, discoloration in deep tissue is exactly the kind of thing that can appear for reasons having nothing whatsoever to do with violence. And now hold the other half with equal honesty. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head also produces deep tissue discoloration. sometimes with no broken skin and no skull fracture at all. A hard fall backward onto a boat deck or a piece of driftwood would do it. So would being struck. So would striking your head on something in the water. The finding is genuinely consistent with an impact. It is also genuinely consistent with the body simply breaking down. That is not a dodge. That is the actual state of the evidence. And any channel telling you this autopsy proved a head injury is telling you something the pathologist explicitly refused to say. One pause here. There is something bleak about a young man's body being discussed this way. Dissections, discoloration, measurements by strangers on the internet who never knew him. He was 18. He played wide receiver. He was somebody's whole world. Now, the second discovery, and the one that raised the most eyebrows in that room. When Nolan Wells's body arrived in Washington, D.C., part of his throat was not with it. The report is specific about what was missing: the anterior internal neck structures. In anatomical terms, that means the trachea, the windpipe, along with the lingual cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone. Mitchell recorded them as absent, not received with the body. That detail drew audible reactions in the room, and it is easy to see why. Stated plainly, the family sent their son to a second pathologist, and the parts of his neck were not in him. But the report immediately does something the viral clips left out. It explains the likely reason, and the explanation is not sinister. Mitchell wrote that it is assumed the initial pathologist retained these structures for additional evaluation, and then in his own report, he wrote this: "The retention of the anterior neck structures during an initial autopsy is a common forensic pathology practice. That is the independent pathologist hired by the family telling you that what Mississippi did here is normal." Crump reinforced it from the podium, explaining that Mitchell himself did exactly this during his 7 years as chief medical examiner in Washington. If there was any concern about the throat, about a fracture or compression of the neck, he too would hold those structures back for closer study. ABC News confirmed the same thing with outside doctors. It is not uncommon for pathologists to remove an organ or tissue in order to examine deeper inside the body. So why does it matter at all? Because of what those structures are. The anterior neck holds the evidence of strangulation and neck compression. The hyoid bone in particular is a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat, and forensic pathologists examine it closely in any death where pressure to the neck is a question, because it can fracture under force. If you want to know whether a person was choked, throttled, or had their airway compressed, those structures are where you look. They are, in effect, the file cabinet where that specific answer is kept. Mitchell did not have them, and so he wrote the line that has driven the last several days of coverage. A posterior neck dissection performed without review of the anterior neck structures is incomplete. Therefore, this pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or a cause of death. Hear the precision in that sentence. He is not saying there was an injury to the neck. He is saying he was not given the material that would let him say there wasn't. And then note the practical demand that grew out of it, because this is what Crump actually asked for, and it is the most reasonable request of the entire press conference. He is not accusing Mississippi of hiding anything. He said plainly that Mitchell does not know why they held the throat back. What he asked is that the state's medical examiner allow Mitchell to review those retained structures and to see the state's photographs and observations of Nolan's body from when it was closer in time to the 4th of July. That is not a demand for a verdict. It is a request for access. One pathologist asking to see what another pathologist already has. Which brings us to the deeper truth underneath this entire report. The one that has nothing to do with anyone's intentions. Mississippi performed a standard autopsy using standard procedures. They retained tissue for further examination, which is normal. They sent toxicology out for testing, which takes time. None of that is unusual. But the family did not trust the process. And whether that mistrust was fair or unfair, it was real. So they sought a second opinion, which is their right. And that second opinion found something the first exam did not look for. Not because it was hidden, but because the dissection that would reveal it is not part of every autopsy. Now both examinations are incomplete in different ways. Mississippi has the neck structures but has not released findings. Mitchell performed deeper dissections but does not have the neck structures or the state's photos. And Nolan's parents are left waiting for 2 incomplete reports to somehow add up to one complete answer. The toxicology results from Mississippi are still pending. The coroner confirmed that publicly, so even the first autopsy, the one performed 3 days closer to the time of death, cannot yet deliver a cause. And the second autopsy, the one the family paid for, ends with the word undetermined. Not unresolved, not suspicious, undetermined. That is a specific forensic term. It means the available evidence is insufficient to reach a conclusion. It does not mean foul play. It does not mean accident. It means the science cannot say. And here is the weight of that. For a family burying their child, undetermined is not closure. It is not justice. It is not even an answer. It is the medical examiner's way of saying the body cannot tell us what happened. So where does that leave the case? With a mark that might be trauma or might be decomposition. With neck structures held in Mississippi that might show compression or might show nothing. With a date of death that cannot be pinpointed. With a toxicology screen that is not complete. And with a preliminary report that asks 7 questions it cannot answer. The first question is, what caused the red discoloration in the deep tissue at the back of Nolan's head? The second is whether that discoloration represents an injury sustained at or around the time of death. The third is what the anterior neck structures, the ones Mississippi retained, will show upon examination. The fourth is whether there is any evidence of neck compression or airway obstruction in those structures. The fifth is what the complete toxicology results will reveal. The sixth is when exactly Nolan Wells died. And the seventh is how. Mitchell listed those questions not because he is unwilling to answer them, but because the evidence he was given does not allow him to. And that is the distinction that separates responsible pathology from speculation. A forensic pathologist's job is not to tell a story, it is to read the body. And when the body has been in warm water for 2 days, then autopsied, then transported 1,000 miles, then autopsied again 6 days later, what the body says is limited. Decomposition erases answers. Time erases answers. Every hour between death and examination reduces what can be known, and in this case, that window was not hours. It was days. So the family is left with a report that confirms their son is dead, but not how he died. That finds a mark worth investigating, but cannot say what it means. That identifies missing structures but cannot examine them, and that ends with the only honest conclusion the science allows: undetermined. That is not the ending anyone wanted, not the family, not the public, not the pathologist, but it is the ending the evidence supports. And it raises a question that goes beyond this case. What happens when the science runs out before the answers do? When a family needs to know and the body cannot tell them? When 2 autopsies are performed and both end incomplete? The answer, in this case, is that the questions remain. And the only way forward is access. Access to the structures Mississippi retained. Access to the photographs the state took. Access to the findings the state has not released. Not to accuse, not to override, but to complete the picture both examinations are trying to build. Because right now, Mississippi has pieces of the puzzle that Mitchell never saw, and Mitchell found pieces that Mississippi never looked for. And until those pieces are laid side by side, no one can say what the full image shows. The family has asked for that. Crump has asked for that. Mitchell, through his report, has implied the need for that. And as of this recording, there has been no public response from the state of Mississippi indicating whether that access will be granted. So this is where Nolan Wells's case sits. Not solved, not closed, not answered, but documented in a way that it was not before, with findings on record that raise questions the first examination did not address, and with a family that refuses to stop asking. The preliminary report is public now. The findings are public. The requests are public. What happens next depends on whether the systems involved are willing to work together instead of in parallel. And for a family that buried their son one day before his second autopsy was read to the world, that is not a small thing. It is everything. If this is the kind of coverage you want to see more of, the kind that stays accurate even when it is difficult, go ahead and subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault and hit that like button. The second autopsy was supposed to answer what the first one did not. But there is a truth about second examinations that almost nobody outside forensic pathology understands, and it has everything to do with sequence. A second autopsy is always a weaker instrument than the first one. Always. Dr. Priya Banerjee, a board-certified forensic pathologist speaking to NBC News with no involvement in this case, put it simply. Second autopsies carry an inherent limitation, she said, because of what a body has already been through during the initial examination. It is never going to be intact or in the pristine state that you get with an unexamined body. Look at what that meant in practice here. During the state's autopsy, Nolan's organs were removed and dissected, which is what an autopsy is. Afterward, as is standard, they were returned to the body cavity so that a second pathologist could examine them if needed. But dissected organs cannot be read the way intact ones can, and that produced what Mitchell himself called the most significant limitation he faced. He could not directly observe the airway and the lungs for water, and he could not directly observe the stomach for its contents. Sit with the weight of that. In a suspected drowning, water in the airway and the lungs is close to the central question. It is one of the primary indicators pathologists use to determine whether a person was alive and breathing when they went into the water. Mitchell could not look at it. The only person who could look at it was the state pathologist in Mississippi on the 7th of July, and that report has not been released. Then add decomposition. The report records marked decompositional changes in the body, and Mitchell explained the consequence directly. Decomposition can obscure the presence or absence of bruising on the skin surface, especially during a second autopsy examination, meaning that even if there had been visible bruises on Nolan Wells when he came out of that water, by the 10th of July, they might no longer be readable. And Banerjee added one more piece of context that cuts against the conspiracy framing. It is not unusual for a secondary examiner to have no access to the findings of the primary examination at all, because laws limit what can be publicly released. The wall between Mitchell and the Mississippi file is not necessarily anyone stonewalling. In many cases, it is simply how the law works. So put the whole picture together honestly. The pathologist the family hired was working with a decomposed body, dissected organs, no lungs to read for water, no stomach contents to time a last meal, no neck structures to check for compression, and no toxicology results. He was, through no fault of his own, examining the least informative version of the evidence that has ever existed in this case. He said so himself. He identified several limitations that create barriers to establishing a definitive cause and manner of death for Nolan Xavier Wells. That is the report's own framing of itself in its own opening line of discussion. Not a finding of foul play, a statement that the body at this stage cannot deliver the answer. Which is exactly why he ended the report the way he did, not with a conclusion, but with a list. Before the list, Mitchell laid out the principle that governs every death like this one, and it reframes the whole investigation. In cases where a death occurs in or around a body of water with suspicion of drowning, he wrote, it is important to confirm how that person entered the water. And he added a qualifier that lands hard in this particular case. This information is especially important for the deaths of persons who can swim. Nolan Wells could swim. His family has said so from the beginning. Crump has repeated it at every appearance. He was an athlete, a college-wide receiver, and by every account, comfortable in the water. So the pathologist asked the questions that follow from that. Was Nolan conscious or unconscious when he entered the water? He does not know. Was he forced into the water or did he enter it unforced? He does not know. And he wrote that definitive circumstances of death are required to determine the manner of death. That principle deserves unpacking, because it explains this entire report better than any headline has. Drowning is one of the hardest determinations in all of forensic pathology. There is no single test for it, no marker that lights up and settles the question. In most other deaths, the body carries its own explanation. A wound, a blockage, a diseased organ, a toxic level of some substance. Drowning frequently leaves none of that. What pathologists look for instead are supporting indicators: fluid and foam in the airway, the condition and weight of the lungs, water in the stomach, signs consistent with a person actively breathing while submerged. And then they weigh those indicators against everything else known about the death. Which is why drowning is often described as a diagnosis of exclusion. A pathologist rules out the other explanations, confirms the findings are consistent with submersion, and considers the circumstances in which the person entered the water. Circumstances are not a footnote in a drowning case. They are part of the diagnosis itself. Now apply that to Dr. Mitchell's situation. He could not examine the airway. He could not examine the lungs for water. He could not examine the stomach contents. He had no toxicology. And he had no reliable account of how Nolan Wells came to be in that water in the first place. Whether he walked in, fell in, was carried by a current, or entered some other way. And whether he was awake when it happened. Every single input the determination requires was either missing or disputed. Under those conditions, a competent pathologist does not guess. He writes undetermined. That word is not a hint about foul play, and it is not a failure of the examination. It is an accurate description of what can be concluded from what he was given. Then came the sentence that has traveled further than any other line in this case. For these reasons, this pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Non-accidental factors. In forensic language, that is the door left open for another person's involvement. And it is why every headline in the country has carried some version of the phrase "cannot rule out foul play." But notice the architecture of that sentence, because it is doing something precise. It does not say the evidence suggests foul play. It says the pathologist cannot exclude it. For these reasons, meaning the limitations he just finished listing. The inability to rule something out is a statement about the strength of the evidence available, not about the strength of the suspicion. A pathologist with a decomposed body, no lungs to examine, and no neck structures cannot rule out a great many things. That is the honest reading. And the family's honest position is that an open door is enough to demand a real investigation. Both of those can be true at once. If you want the rest of this case covered the same way, with precision instead of rage bait, subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault right now and hit that like button, because what comes next matters more than what the autopsy found. Mitchell closed his preliminary report with 7 outstanding questions. The things he says must be answered before anyone can call this case understood. They are worth hearing in full because they are effectively the investigative to-do list now sitting in front of Mississippi authorities. 1. What were the circumstances that led to Nolan Xavier Wells entering the water? 2. What was the position of the body when it was found? Crump noted at the podium that a member of the United Cajun Navy, one of the volunteer groups involved in the search, has said Nolan was found face down and fully clothed. 3. Was there water in the airway? 4. Is there any evidence of injuries to the anterior neck structures, the ones he never received? 5. Is there any evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging, bleeding inside the skull? Note how directly that connects to the red discoloration at the back of the head. The state pathologist examining the brain on the 7th of July could have answered it. Mitchell, receiving the body after the brain had been removed, could not. 6. What was the composition of the stomach contents? This is the timing question. Stomach contents help establish how long it had been since a person's last meal, which in turn helps place the hour of death. 7. What are the toxicology report findings? Then his conclusion. The best classification for the cause and manner of death of Nolan Xavier Wells is undetermined, pending investigation. And a final procedural note, that this forensic pathologist reserves the right to review and incorporate additional forensic pathology information into his opinion as it becomes available. The above opinions, he wrote, are expressed to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Signed, Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., the 19th of July, 2024. Look closely at those 7 questions and something becomes clear. 6 of the 7 can only be answered by the state of Mississippi. The airway, the brain, the neck structures, the stomach contents, the toxicology, the condition of the body when it was first recovered. Every one of those answers exists in a file in Mississippi, held by the state medical examiner, unreleased. That is why Crump spent so much of that press conference asking for access rather than accusing anyone of a crime. His stated ask was narrow. Let Mitchell see the photographs. Let him see the observations of Nolan's body from closer in time to the 4th of July. And when this case reaches the grand jury, put Dr. Mitchell in front of it. We want all relevant information to be heard by the grand jury, he said. He also gave voice to the family's growing impatience, and he chose his words carefully. We are trying to be respectful and collaborative as much as we can, he said. But it is always troublesome to all of us when these investigations just take forever. So how have the authorities responded? Fairly, and this section matters because it is the part the outrage videos skip entirely. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has said there was no initial indication of a crime, but he has paired that with something else at every opportunity. That his investigators are working diligently to determine exactly what occurred. Speaking to ABC News, he said Nolan Wells' family deserves a thorough and factual investigation, and that is exactly what they are going to get. And here is the detail that almost never makes it into coverage of this case. The sheriff's office has said it welcomes the family's independent investigation, not resisted it, welcomed it. That is not the posture of an agency trying to bury something, and honest reporting has to say so. The scale of the work has grown too. According to Mississippi's Sun-Herald, the Sheriff's Department has now interviewed dozens of witnesses and is working with the FBI on the case. The Jackson County District Attorney has told the same outlet that the case is a priority and confirmed she will forward the results of the law enforcement investigation to a grand jury to decide whether any charges are warranted. The Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn Jr. has confirmed the state's autopsy report is not yet finished and that once it is complete, it will be provided to his office. He also offered CNN a piece of context that deserves to sit alongside everything else in this story. Over the years, his office has received numerous drowning victims from Mississippi's barrier islands. The currents near Horn Island can be notoriously rough. The island has no shelters, no restrooms, and no communications. People go into that water, and sometimes they do not come out. None of that proves how Nolan Wells died. but it is the reason a drowning finding, if it eventually comes, would not be some improbable conclusion invented to close a case. It would be the most statistically ordinary outcome on that stretch of coast. Now, the other side of that ledger, the families, in their own words, because their distrust did not appear out of nowhere, Christine Wansley told the room in Chicago how much contact she has had with the agency investigating her son's death. The last time she actually spoke with the sheriff's department, by her account, was a day or two after Nolan's body was found, and she is the one who initiated it. She sent a text message. "This is Christine, Nolan's mom. I just want to see if there are any updates." He called back. "There were no updates. We are still interviewing." That was roughly 2 weeks before she stood at that podium. "It is heartbreaking," she said, "and it is concerning, but the root of it for both parents goes back to a single moment on the 6th of July. By Christine's account, Nolan's body had not been removed from that scene for even an hour before the sheriff publicly characterized the death as an accidental drowning with no foul play suspected, before any autopsy, before toxicology, before the interviews that are still going on. She had asked investigators to treat the case as though Nolan were their own child, and they had promised her they would. Then that statement went out. Everything the family has done since, the independent autopsy, the national attorney, the press conferences, traces back to that hour. And though the family met with the district attorney who promised transparency going forward, Christine's answer to that was blunt. The damage has already been done, because that early conclusion is now the narrative the general public carries. She also laid out again the things that do not sit right with her. 300 to 400 people were on Horn Island that day. You mean to tell me nobody saw anything? And the details she keeps returning to. The one no explanation has satisfied. An 18-year-old choosing to stay behind on an island does not send his phone home on the boat. He does not send his car keys home either. If he had planned to stay, she says, he would have said, "Give me my phone, give me my keys." It is not adding up. Underneath all of it sits the conflict this case has never resolved. The young woman who says Nolan told her he was getting back on the boat with his friends, and the friends who say he told them he was staying behind to talk with her. The sheriff has said his investigators' interviews indicate Nolan chose to stay, believing he would get a ride back with someone else, and that the friends have cooperated with the investigation. Two accounts still standing in opposition, still unresolved by anyone with the authority to resolve them, and there is a dimension of this case that cannot be reported around, because it is a documented fact and because the family has placed it at the center of their own argument. Nolan Wells was the only black person in the group that traveled to Horn Island that day. The rest of the group was white, and video from the island showed a largely white crowd. The Associated Press has reported that the family's distrust has been deepened by the state's long legacy of racism. The NOP, at whose national convention these findings were released, has adopted a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the United States Department of Justice, to conduct a thorough and transparent investigation into Nolan's death. Crump made that argument explicitly in Chicago, and it is his argument, so it is reported here as his. He invoked Emmett Till and Medgar Evers, two Mississippi names that need no explanation, and he posed a hypothetical directly to the room. If the roles had been reversed, 3 young white men returning without a black teenager who ended up dead, would the investigation have looked the same? Would there have been a choice about whether to cooperate? Would phones have been examined immediately rather than eventually? "We do not want anything special," he said. "We just want equal justice. Whether you find that argument persuasive is your call. What is not in dispute is that it is the argument the family is making in public, and it is now part of the record of this case." So where does everything actually stand as of this recording? The independent autopsy is complete and preliminary, undetermined, pending investigation, with 7 open questions, and a pathologist who has reserved the right to revise his opinion as more information arrives. The state's autopsy is done, but unreleased, still waiting on toxicology. The sheriff's investigation continues, with dozens of witnesses interviewed and the FBI assisting. The district attorney has committed to sending the completed file to a grand jury. Crump has asked that Dr. Mitchell be permitted to review Mississippi's photographs and retain neck structures, and that he be called to testify before that grand jury. No one has been charged. No one has been publicly named a suspect, and the cause of Nolan Wells' death remains officially and independently unknown. Which brings this back to the question this report was supposed to answer, and the strange thing it did instead. There is also a practical consequence, to an undetermined ruling that is worth understanding before that grand jury ever convenes. A criminal case involving a death generally requires establishing how the death happened. A prosecutor has to be able to tell a jury what killed the person and connect someone's conduct to it. An undetermined cause of death does not make that impossible, but it makes it substantially harder. And it puts enormous weight on everything outside the autopsy. The timeline, the witness accounts, the digital evidence, the physical scene. That is precisely why Crump is fighting so hard to get Mitchell in front of the grand jury, and why he wants Mississippi's photographs and retained tissue reviewed. If the medical evidence stays undetermined, the circumstances become the case. And right now, the circumstances are exactly what remain in dispute. Everyone expected the second autopsy to settle something. It settled almost nothing about the body, but it settled a great deal about where the answer now has to come from. Mitchell examined Nolan Wells as thoroughly as a second pathologist can, took him apart layer by layer, looking for violence, and found no fractures, no deep tissue injuries, no lacerations. One unexplained area of discoloration that may be trauma or may be decomposition, and a set of doors he could not open because the material was in another state. What that means is that the body at this point has said what it can say. The rest of this case does not live in a morgue. It lives in the circumstances. The 90 minutes between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the moment the boat left without him, the phone that went home while he did not, the two irreconcilable accounts of what he said he was going to do, 300 to 400 people on that island, and so far no public account of what any of them saw after 3 in the afternoon. Dr. Mitchell said it in his own way, and it is the most important line in his report. Definitive circumstances of death are required to determine the manner of death. He is telling investigators in writing that the pathology has gone as far as it can. Everything else is on them. When the toxicology lands, when the state's report is released, when that grand jury acts, the verified breakdown will be here, and nothing before it is confirmed. If that is how you want this case covered, subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault and turn on notifications so you do not miss it. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a graduate of Ocean Springs High School, a rising sophomore wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, days from reporting back for his season. On the 21st of July, hundreds of people filled a church in Ocean Springs to bury him. And the next morning, his mother sat in a room in Chicago and listened to a stranger read her son's autopsy out loud. She has said what she wants over and over, and it has never changed. Not a verdict, not a conviction, just this: that someone treat her son's case as if he were their own child.